Since the beginning of the pandemic, it has been clear that it affects everyone, and so all people have to be protected without discrimination. In fact, the motto of the European Union is United in Diversity. Therefore, even though organizing and delivering healthcare is the responsibility of national governments and not a competence of the EU, the European Union has tried to prevent and contain the pandemic despite the divergence of the European countries. And while this happens, there are researches in a number of countries that have found a higher risk of infection for migrants than for native-born citizens. In this context, it is fundamental to take a look at the EU countries, paying special attention in Greece, which is the main host country for migrants in Europe, due to its geographical position. My name is Adlas Asati. I am the director of the Greek Forum of Migrants, and I am based in Athens, Greece. In this video, we are going to answer the following questions. To what extent the crisis has affected the migrant communities? What have the EU institutions and member states done about it? And what about the European Union motto? Are we really united in diversity? In order to answer these questions, we have to go back in time. On the 27th of December 2020, the EU launched its vaccination campaign, and 1 year later, in August 2021, 70% of its adult population was vaccinated, a great victory against the pandemic. However, not every community has had the same share of vaccination, and that is why international and EU bodies have recommended addressing marginalized communities, including migrants in situations of vulnerability, in national vaccination strategies. Besides, according to the European Commission, one crucial part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been community outreach, particularly within those communities that are more vulnerable or socially excluded. For this, civil society organizations have been translating and communicating vital information to their own and other communities, and authorities have also made an effort to communicate vital information in multiple languages. Unfortunately, despite the Union's promises for a greater inclusion, the situation of vulnerable people has only worsened during the crisis. Furthermore, the pandemic has also made migrants' life harder, affecting procedures to apply for and obtain residence or working permits, and therefore easier access to healthcare, as government offices have been reducing their services or sometimes entirely closing. Consequently, despite the general prevalence in key services, the employment rate amongst migrants has dropped since the virus outbreak. In Spain, for example, unemployment within the migrant population had risen almost 25% by early September 2020. But has this happened throughout the EU? Not really. In Portugal, for instance, the government granted temporary residence for migrants and asylum seekers who had pending applications for residence permit when the state of emergency was declared in March. This gave them access to healthcare, and it then repeated the action in November when a second state of emergency was declared. In Greece, the vulnerable part of the population, which is migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, they are marginalized. If they are undocumented, they are excluded from the social system, even sometimes from the healthcare system. The good news is that since the beginning of October 2021, there is a new law for undocumented migrants in the country, which gives them a provisional security number so that they can have access to vaccination. But the access to the vaccination has not been the only problem for migrants, because even though EU-wide statistics on returns are not yet available for the whole of 2020, it appears that many EU countries have continued with the return procedures despite the health issue following the European Commission guidelines. Therefore, other non-state actors have taken over this urgent situation, trying to help people marginalized by immigration policy lags. In the end, the imbalance between the willingness of EU inclusion and the COVID-19 impact of the migrant communities leads me to wonder about the effectiveness of the EU motto and the real unity in diversity. But hopefully some measures are emerging. As of the 15th of November 2021, the European Parliament and the Council reached an agreement on the European Union 2022 budget, allocating more funds to the health sector. So, to sum up, the pandemic has only worsened the situation of migrant communities, highlighting the problems of the EU inclusion policy. Vulnerable people have been even more deeply marginalized and excluded by the governments and health systems. I don't believe we are truly united in diversity, and some countries prefer to act on their own, forgetting the unity part of the motto. It is true that since the beginning of the pandemic, the EU has taken a series of measures to protect European citizens and that border laws and travel have been reviewed to limit the spread of the virus throughout Europe. So theoretically, the health system has achieved access to vaccines for all without discrimination, but in reality, some part of the population was more impacted by the COVID-19 crisis than others and was left alone. Besides, migrants are not only excluded by the healthcare system, but also the rise of unemployment because of their marginalization accentuated by the pandemic. And that is why the non-state organizations should get more support and consideration from the EU, as they have an intermediary position between government decision and people. But above all, we need to be united, accept our differences and move forward, because the difficult part will come after the end of the pandemic, when we will need to build again what we lost as European society, and this is really crucial.